The meeting was over. Mr. Shaw of Pioneer Development stood, his suit jacket falling perfectly into place. He smoothed it with a practiced downward motion of his palms. The air in the county planning annex was stale with the smell of weak coffee and old paper. Fluorescent lights hummed a low, constant note. Shaw smiled, a patient, professional expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was looking at the dozen or so people sitting on mismatched metal chairs. They were the last holdouts, the neighbors, the curious. Most had already been bought out, their fields and small farmhouses now just lines on Pioneer subdivision plat. He had saved the last piece of business for the end, a formality. He nodded toward the back of the room where a man sat alone, his hands resting on his knees. The man's shirt was clean, but frayed at the collar. His boots, though wiped, still held the fine, pale dust of the county road. He hadn't spoken a word for the entire 90-minute meeting.
He just watched. Shaw cleared his throat, his voice filling the small space. Our final offer for the 5-acre parcel, Mr. Penn, is $9,000. We feel this is more than fair, given the land's current agricultural zoning. It allows you to settle your father's estate cleanly. The room was quiet. A woman in the front row checked her phone. A man beside her coughed softly into his fist. The offer was an echo of the letters, the phone calls, an insult dressed up as a courtesy. The man in the back, Arthur Penn, did not respond immediately. He seemed to be considering the worn linoleum floor. Then, slowly, he pushed himself to his feet. His movements were deliberate, economical. He was not a large man, but his stillness gave him a certain weight. He walked forward, no words, no hesitation. He carried a pale blue folder, the kind with 2 metal prongs inside, the cardboard softened with age. On the front, written in a faded black grease pencil, were 3 characters: Lot 7B. He reached the folding table at the front of the room where Mr. Shaw and 2 county commissioners sat. He did not look at them. He placed the blue folder on the table. The sound it made was soft, a barely audible thud that seemed to absorb all the other noise in the room. Then he spoke, his voice even, without anger or argument. Before we discuss the price, he said, we should probably discuss the title. Mr. Shaw's smile tightened by a millimeter. He glanced at the folder but did not touch it. Beside him, Commissioner Davies, a man who ran a local insurance agency, shifted in his chair. The room, which had been drifting toward the exit, pulled back. Phones were lowered. The stale air thickened with sudden attention. At the center of it was Arthur Penn, a man of 64 who looked as if he had been carved from the same tough, patient timber as the fence posts that lined his property. His face was a map of sun and wind. His hands, resting now at his sides, were calloused but clean, the nails short and square. He was the kind of man institutions like Pioneer Development were built to overlook. He was a remnant, a piece of a past they were there to pave over. Shaw represented the inevitable future, cul-de-sacs named after the trees they had cleared, homeowners associations, and rising tax revenues for the county. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. His tie was silk. He held a leather-bound portfolio containing market analyses, environmental impact statements, and signed purchase agreements. Everything was in order. Everything, it seemed, except for Lot 7B. The 5-acre pasture in question was the last piece of the puzzle. It was a rectangle of unexceptional land, overgrown with fescue and wild clover, sloping down to a dry creek bed. To Pioneer, it was a necessary acquisition for their planned water runoff and a small park. To the county, it was underutilized acreage. To Arthur Penn, it was the last piece of his father. He had lived his whole life in the small farmhouse his father had built, on the other side of the road from that pasture. He had buried both his parents in the church cemetery 2 miles away. He lived a quiet life, governed by the predictable cycles of maintenance and repair. He was not a man who sought conflict. But he was also not a man who ceded ground that was his. To understand why Arthur Penn stood in that room with a 58-year-old folder, you have to go back. Not just the 6 months since the first letter from Pioneer Development had arrived, but decades further. 22 years before that morning, Arthur had stood in the same pasture with his wife Eleanor. It was a cool evening in early autumn. She had pointed to the crest of the small hill. "That's where the sun says goodbye last," she'd said. It was her favourite spot. They had planned to build a small house there one day when they retired.
A house with a large porch facing west, a place to watch the sun say goodbye.
Eleanor had been gone for 12 years now. The plans for the house were gone with her. The pasture remained. The memory remained. 6 months ago, the first letter came. It was printed on heavy cream-coloured letterhead, Pioneer Development, a polite, firm offer of $7,000. He had read it at his kitchen table, the same table his mother had served 1,000 meals on. He had folded the letter and placed it in a drawer with the unpaid bills and the tractor repair manuals. He did not reply. The phone calls started 2 weeks later. A cheerful young woman from the development company, then a more serious man, an acquisitions specialist. They spoke of progress, of community benefit. They raised the offer to $8,000. He listened politely. He always said the same thing. "I'll have to think on it." After one of those calls, he had gone up to the attic.
The air was warm and smelled of cedar and dust.
In a heavy wooden trunk beneath his father's folded army uniform and a box of old family photographs was the pale blue folder. He had known it was there. He had not looked at it in 30 years, but he knew its exact location. His father, William Penn, had been a man of meticulous order. Everything had a place. Arthur sat on the dusty floorboards and opened the folder. The document inside was typed on an old manual typewriter, the letters slightly uneven, some fainter than others. It was a mineral deed, dated October 17th, 1962. It conveyed to William Penn, his heirs and assigns, forever, all rights to the oil, gas, and other minerals on and under the property, legally described as Lot 7B. He remembered the story. A man from Texas had come through the county in the early 60s, leasing mineral rights, convinced there was oil. He had drilled a test well on a neighbouring farm and found nothing.
Broke and discouraged, he had offered to sell the rights he'd leased back to the landowners for pennies on the dollar. Most had laughed him off. Why buy back something worthless? But William Penn had paid the man $50, not because he believed there was oil. He did it on principle. A man should own his land from the sky to the centre of the earth, he told the young Arthur. If you let them slice it up, you don't really own it at all. He had taken the deed to the county courthouse and had it recorded himself. He made sure the stamp was right, the filing number correct. He had shown Arthur the recorded copy. "See here," he'd said, his finger tracing the official stamp. "Now it's real. Now it's part of the land, forever." Arthur spent the next 3 weeks not in the attic, but at the county records office. He wasn't looking for the document. He was confirming its unassailable place in the public record. The county clerk, Frank Abernathy, a man he'd known since childhood, helped him pull the old plat books. They smelled of aging paper and binder's glue. He unspooled reels of microfilm, the machine whirring softly in the quiet room. He traced the property transfers, the zoning changes, the tax assessments from 1962 to the present day. The surface rights had been bought and sold 3 times before his father acquired the parcel in 1955. But the subsurface rights, the mineral estate, had been severed only once, in that lease to the Texan, and they had been returned and recorded only once, to William Penn, in 1962. They had never been mentioned again, never sold, never transferred, never extinguished. It was a ghost in the county's machine, a quiet fact everyone had forgotten to check. Because nobody thought to look. It was just an empty pasture. William Penn had bought the land after coming home from Korea.
He had worked for 2 years at the local lumber mill, saving every dollar that didn't go to his mother. He bought the 30 acres on the county road because it had a good well and a solid barn. The pasture, the 5 acres across the road, was part of the deal. He married a girl from the next town over and built the house himself, with the help of his 2 brothers. He was not a man given to speeches. He taught his son Arthur through action. He taught him how to set a fence post so it wouldn't heave in the winter frost. You dig deep, he'd say, and you tamp the earth down hard. You build it right, you only have to build it once. He taught him how to read the sky for rain, how to repair a diesel engine with patience and a clean rag. He taught him that a man's word was his bond, but a recorded deed was better. There was a story Arthur remembered from when he was 10 years old. A neighbour's cow had gotten through the fence into the pasture.
William had walked the fence line with Arthur, looking for the break. They found it in the far corner, where a post had rotted at the base. As they dug a new post hole, his father had stopped and picked up a piece of shale, turning it over in his hand. "People only see what's on top, Art," he'd said. "They see the grass. They don't see the soil, the rock, the water running deep underneath. But what's underneath is what holds it all up." That was the principle he lived by. The value of things was not in their appearance, but in their foundation. When he died 20 years ago, he had left no debts and one piece of advice in a letter he'd written for Arthur. "Don't ever sell the pasture," he wrote. "Not unless you have to. It's good land. It holds the afternoon sun." He never mentioned the mineral rights in the letter. He didn't have to. He had taught his son to know what he owned, from the grass on top to the rock deep underneath. For Arthur, the pasture was more than just land. It was a promise. It was the place Eleanor had loved. It was the physical embodiment of his father's foresight, of his quiet, unshakable principles. The $9,000 offer wasn't just low. It was an erasure. It sought to reduce his father's legacy and his wife's memory to a rounding error on a developer's balance sheet. It was an offer made by men who saw only the grass. And so, Arthur Penn had taken the old blue folder and driven his 20-year-old Ford truck into town to the county planning annex to correct the record. He had not come to argue. He had come to present a fact. Back in the meeting room, Mr. Shaw finally picked up the folder. He opened it with the weary air of a man indulging a child. His eyes scanned the first page. He was a fast reader. His expression did not change, but a subtle tension entered his shoulders. He was looking at a legal document, properly executed and recorded. This was not the rambling, handwritten complaint he had expected. This was something else. "Mr. Penn," he said, his voice a study in practiced calm, "our title company performed an exhaustive search of the chain of title for this parcel. I can assure you it is clean. Pioneer Development is a reputable company. We follow procedure to the letter." He was trying to re-establish control, to frame this as a misunderstanding by a layman. Arthur stood his ground. He did not raise his voice. He did not lean forward. He simply stated another fact. "Your title search was for the surface estate," he said. "This is the subsurface estate. It was severed from the surface in 1961 and reunited with my father's deed in 1962. The filing number is right there, at the top." He pointed a steady finger at the document. Shaw looked. At the top right corner, a faint purple stamp from the county recorder's office and a number, handwritten in black ink. The open loop in the conversation, the name of the folder, was now closed. Lot 7B was not just a name Arthur had invented. It was the legal description on a 58-year-old deed. Shaw's professional composure began to fray at the edges. He was a deal maker, a negotiator. He was used to arguments about price, about zoning variances, about timelines. He was not used to being contradicted on a point of fundamental fact in a public meeting. He felt the eyes of the commissioners on him, the quiet attention of the room. He could not afford to look incompetent. He shifted to his first line of defense, the appeal to institutional authority and the passage of time. Shaw placed the document back on the table, aligning it perfectly with the edge. "It's a historical curiosity, Mr. Penn," he said, his tone softening, becoming educational. "An interesting piece of your family's history. But a filing that old, especially for mineral rights that were never exploited, is almost certainly considered dormant. It would have been extinguished by subsequent comprehensive zoning plans or by the Marketable Title Act. It's a procedural nullity." He used the legal term with confidence, a piece of jargon meant to intimidate, to end the discussion. He was betting Arthur Penn did not know what a procedural nullity was. He was wrong. Arthur had spent a Saturday at the public library 3 weeks ago, reading about the state's Marketable Title Act. He had read it slowly, twice. The act was designed to simplify land transfers by extinguishing old claims, but it had a specific exception, one his father had inadvertently satisfied. The mineral deed was not a claim. It was a separately recorded title. It had been re-registered with the county every 20 years, just as the law required for such severed interests. His father had done it in 1982. Arthur had done it himself in 2002. It was not dormant. It was active. It was alive. It was not extinguished, Arthur said. The deed was filed under the Dormant Mineral Act statute, and its registration has been maintained. The last renewal was filed in 2002. The next one is due in 2022. He spoke the words plainly, without triumph. He was simply reciting the facts he had gathered. The room was now utterly still. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder. Shaw's confidence wavered. He had been prepared for an emotional argument about family heritage. He had not been prepared for a calm recitation of statute. He quickly shifted to his second angle, a pivot from legal theory to practical reality. He spread his hands wide, an open, reasonable gesture. "Okay, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that you're right. What are we really talking about here? There is no oil under your pasture, Mr. Penn. A test well proved that 60 years ago. These rights have no practical value. We are building homes. We need to grade the land, dig foundations for basements, run sewer and water lines. We're talking about disturbing the top 10, maybe 12 feet of soil. It's a matter of construction, not extraction." He was trying to minimize the issue, to frame Arthur's position as an obstructionist technicality. It was an appeal to the common sense of the room. Don't let this old piece of paper stand in the way of progress. Arthur did not take the bait. He did not argue about the value of the minerals. He did not argue about progress. He kept his focus narrow, precise. "The deed grants ownership of the land from the surface to the center of the earth," he replied. "Your plans require you to enter my property, the subsurface property. You don't have the right to do that." His refusal to engage on Shaw's terms was more powerful than any argument. He was a rock, and Shaw's waves of reasonable-sounding rhetoric were breaking against him. Frustration was now clearly visible on Shaw's face. His smile was gone. He turned to the third tactic, the emotional appeal, the invocation of community. He lowered his voice, trying to sound earnest. "Mr. Penn, Arthur, look around this room. Your neighbors have all agreed. This development means new roads, better services, a stronger school tax base. It's for the good of the whole community. Are you going to be the one person who stands in the way of that? Over a piece of paper for minerals that don't even exist?" He was trying to isolate him, to paint him as selfish, to turn the room against him. Arthur Penn looked not at Shaw, but at the other people in the room. He saw his neighbors. Some looked at the floor, uncomfortable. Some looked at him with a new curiosity. He had known these families his whole life. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice still quiet, but carrying to every corner of the room. "My father taught me you do things right or you don't do them at all. This isn't being done right." The impasse was total. Mr. Shaw, his 3 arguments dismantled, stood in silence.
His polished confidence had evaporated, replaced by a tight, angry frustration. He was a man accustomed to predictable processes, to forms filled out correctly, to predictable human motivations like greed. Arthur Penn fit none of his models. He wasn't asking for more money. He was pointing out a flaw in the very foundation of the deal, a flaw of assumption. Shaw's company had assumed the land was simple. It was not. Finally, Commissioner Davies, a man who disliked unresolved conflict, cleared his throat. He looked toward the side of the room where a quiet, older man had been observing the entire exchange. "Frank," he said, "you're the county clerk. You know the records better than anyone. Can you help us here? Is there anything to this?" It was a lifeline for Shaw, a chance for a neutral authority to dismiss the claim and restore order. All eyes turned to Frank Abernathy. He was a tall, stooped man in his late 60s, with thin grey hair and glasses that hung from a cord around his neck. He had been the county clerk for 41 years. He had seen developers come and go. He had seen families lose their farms and other families get rich. He knew the history of the county, not as a series of newspaper headlines, but as a dense, complex web of deeds, liens, easements, and court orders filed away in the cool, dry basement of the courthouse. He rose slowly from his chair and walked to the front table. He did not hurry. He moved with the unhurried pace of a man who deals in permanent records. He ignored Shaw. He nodded once to Arthur. "Arthur," he said, his voice soft. He picked up the document from the pale blue folder. His fingers, stained with the faint grey of ancient ink and dust, handled the paper with a familiar reverence. He read it, though it was clear he already knew what it said. He had helped Arthur find the microfilm copy himself. The room held its breath. Shaw watched him, a muscle twitching in his jaw. He was expecting Abernathy to find a loophole, a technical error, something to render the document void. Abernathy finished reading. He placed the paper carefully back on the table. He looked up, not at the commissioners, but directly at Mr. Shaw. His gaze was steady, impartial. "The Pioneer title search was incomplete," he stated. "It only covered the surface plat as recorded in 1978. This document is a prior and perpetual mineral deed, properly recorded in 1962. It created a separate estate, the subsurface estate. It was never extinguished. It was never merged back into the surface title. His father, William Penn, renewed its registration in 82. Arthur renewed it in 2002. It's valid. According to this deed and the records of this county, Arthur Penn owns the mineral rights to Lot 7B. Pioneer Development cannot grade, excavate, or otherwise disturb the subsurface without his express written permission." He delivered the sentences like a judge reading a verdict. Each word was precise, final. There was no ambiguity. The institutional assumption, the one on which Pioneer had based its entire multi-million-dollar project, had just been declared null and void by the one man in the room whose word on the matter was law. A profound silence settled over the room. The hum of the lights, the ticking of the clock on the wall, the sound of a car passing on the street outside, all of it seemed amplified. Mr. Shaw stood frozen for a moment, the colour draining from his face. His carefully constructed world of contracts and timelines had just collapsed. The other people in the room exchanged glances. A quiet murmur started near the back. The power dynamic had been completely inverted, not by a threat or a lawsuit, but by a quiet man with a 58-year-old piece of paper. Shaw recovered quickly, his professional training kicking in. He forced a tight smile and gestured for Arthur to step aside, away from the table, an attempt to make the conversation private. Mr. Penn, he said, his voice now a low, conspiratorial whisper. All right, you've made your point. Clearly, there's been an oversight, a correctable oversight. Let's be practical. What's it going to take to make this right? We can add something to the offer to acquire the mineral rights as well. What's your number? 20,000? 30? Name your price. We can wrap this up today. He had reverted to his most basic tool, money. He assumed this had been a negotiating tactic all along, a clever bit of theatre to drive up the price. He was attempting to buy his way out of his company's mistake. He was, once again, making an assumption about Arthur Penn. Arthur looked at the man. He saw the expensive suit, the desperate eyes, the checkbook ready to solve any problem. He thought of his father, digging a post hole in the cool morning air.
He thought of Eleanor, watching the sunset from the top of the hill. He thought of the quiet promise he had made to himself. This was not about price. It had never been about price. It was about principle. The pasture isn't for sale, Arthur said. The words were quiet, but they had the force of a slammed door. Shaw stared at him, uncomprehending. What do you mean it's not for sale? Everything is for sale. We're offering you more than 4 times the original price. I'm not a seller, Arthur said. Shaw's face cycled through disbelief, then anger, then a cold, hard realization. He finally understood. He was not in a negotiation. He had already lost. He had lost the moment he underestimated the quiet man in the back of the room. Without another word, Shaw turned, walked back to the table, and snapped his leather portfolio shut. The sound echoed in the silent room. He nodded curtly to the commissioners and walked out of the planning annex, his associates scrambling to follow him. The meeting was over. The development was dead. There was no celebration, no applause. Arthur Penn simply watched them go. He walked to the table and picked up the mineral deed, folding it carefully along its original creases. He slid it back into the pale blue folder. He tucked the folder into the inside pocket of his coat. Before leaving, he noticed that 2 of the metal chairs had been knocked askew during the quiet commotion. He took a moment to push them back into place, aligning them with the others in a neat row. He nodded once to Frank Abernathy, a small gesture of acknowledgement and thanks between 2 men who understood the importance of keeping records straight. Then he walked out into the afternoon sun. That evening, Arthur Penn did not sit in his kitchen counting the money he had turned down. He did not call anyone to tell them of his victory. The vindication was a quiet internal thing, a settling of accounts. He walked across the county road and unlatched the gate to the pasture. The air was warm and the scent of clover was strong. He walked slowly up the gentle slope, his boots making soft impressions in the thick grass. He walked to the crest of the hill, the place Eleanor had loved, the spot where the sun said goodbye last. The sun was low in the sky now, a great orange orb hanging over the distant line of trees. The light washed over the field, turning the green to gold. He stood there for a long time, watching the colours deepen. He wasn't thinking about pioneer development or Mr. Shaw. He was thinking about his father's hands, calloused and strong, teaching him how to splice a wire fence. He was thinking about his wife's laugh, carried on the wind in this exact spot. This land wasn't a parcel number. It wasn't a surface estate or a subsurface estate. It was a repository of memory. It was the foundation that held everything else up. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smooth stone he had picked up from the field earlier in the week. It was a simple piece of shale, grey and flat. He held it in his palm, the stone warm from his body heat. He remembered his father's words. They can print more money. They can't print more land. What's underneath is what holds it all up.
He closed his hand around the stone, a small, solid piece of the truth, and put it back in his pocket. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, and he turned and walked back toward the house, his shadow long behind him on the quiet, protected earth. Arthur Penn's pasture remains untouched, a small island of green amid the county's slow march of progress. But 1,000 miles away, in a dusty library in a city that has forgotten its own history, a librarian named Eleanor Vance is about to notice a single, misplaced stamp on a city charter from 1889. That stamp is worth more than the building she's sitting in. Stay with us.